Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome to webinar number 6, Design Elements and Federal Cap and Trade Proposals. This is the 6th in our series on cap and trade design. This is Judy Greenwald from the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. We are co-sponsoring this series with the World Resources Institute and the New America Foundation, and I'm glad that you all could join us today. We are very, very fortunate today. We have two people who are in the middle of the federal climate change debate and are probably two of the busiest people on Capitol Hill, so we're very fortunate to have them share their insights with us today. First, we're going to hear from David Mcintosh, who's the Counsel and Legislative Assistant for Energy and the Environment for Senator Joseph Lieberman, and then Lori Schmidt, who's the Counsel for Energy and Commerce Committee, the U.S. House of Representatives. And as a reminder, many of you have been involved in our webinars before, but the way that you ask questions is that you type in a box in the upper left corner of your screen. You can type in questions. The way we're going to work this is, for the most part, we're going to be doing questions at the end, but we will take a few questions during the presentations and between presentations just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understanding what the speakers are talking about, and if anybody's got a really burning question, they can't wait till the end. But we are going to try to have more of a discussion towards the end. So the first speaker we're going to hear from is David Mcintosh, and as I mentioned, he works for Senator Lieberman, and as many of you know, Senator Lieberman is the leading co-sponsor of the leading climate change legislation in the Senate that recently got out of the Senate and Environment and Public Works Committee and is on its way to the floor for Senate consideration. And Senator Lieberman is the chair of one of the subcommittees on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. David handles the Senator's work on climate legislation. Prior to joining Senator Lieberman's staff in April of 2006, David served as a Maryland Assistant Attorney General representing the state's air agency. Before that, he worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council as a Clean Air Act litigator and regulatory lawyer. David graduated from Harvard Law School in 1998 and clerked for a U.S. District Court judge in Washington, D.C. before joining Covington and Burling as litigation associate. After we hear from David, we're going to hear from Lori Schmidt. She's counsel to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where she focuses on equality and climate change issues. As many of you know, Chairman Dingell of this Energy and Commerce Committee has the lead for climate change legislation in the House. And prior to joining the committee in October 2005, Lori spent almost 15 years at the Environmental Protection Agency working on air quality issues in both the Office of the General Counsel and the Office of Air and Radiation. Prior to that, Lori was an associate at Paul, Hastings, Janosky, and Walker, where she handled litigation and regulatory issues. Lori graduated from Harvard Law School in 1984 and clerked for a U.S. District Court judge in Indianapolis, Indiana. And one more thing before we go to David, I forgot to mention, if you want to do questions by phone, I mentioned if you want to type in questions, you can type it into that box on the upper left-hand corner. But if you want to, actually, you can also do questions by phone. Those we probably won't take until the end because we won't want to interrupt the presenters. But if you do want to call in by phone, then what you do is you press *1 on your phone. Is that right, Laura?
That's correct.
Yeah. And so if you're interested in getting in a queue on the phone line, press *1, and then you'll get on a queue, and we will go to the phones when we can. So take it away, David Mcintosh.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me, and I hope that you can hear me okay. My understanding is that many of you are listening into this call because you are the people who are working right now on designing state and or regional greenhouse gas reduction policies in the U.S., and that you are potentially looking for lessons learned or structures that have been both substantively and politically helpful or unhelpful at the federal level, and also maybe looking for some sort of an idea on where the federal government may be going substantively with its plan. I thought I would speak for maybe just about 15 minutes and divide it up into two parts. For the second part, I thought maybe I would just try to describe clearly what the bill that came out of the EPW committee in December, what it does and says with respect to state authority, and what it does and says particularly with respect to state laws and other policies to reduce greenhouse gases at the state and regional level. For the first part, I thought I would spend just a few minutes describing in particular one way in which actually we in the federal government are probably subject to very different pressures from those that you are subject to with respect to writing a system like this, and how those very different pressures actually may end up leading you to do things in a way differently from how we at least have been writing the laws so far at the federal level. And that really has to do with the fact that at the federal level, we seem to be required politically to enact or write the details of a comprehensive global warming law at the same time that we are trying to enact the goal of the comprehensive global warming law. We are finding that, or have found to date, that the Congress is really not willing, as an institution, to enact an emission reduction goal for the United States until it knows and its constituent members know what the details of this system are, really how those reductions are going to be achieved. That people are simply not willing to throw out a target there without seeing really in a very detailed way how that target is going to be achieved and whether that works for their different regions of the country and their different constituencies and their different policy preferences. So we're really forced to do those two big things at once, enact all the details at the same time that we're trying to enact the overall goal. That's very different from what, say, they're doing in Europe, where to a large extent in Europe, both the EU in general and the member states specifically, they essentially have gotten political consensus on what the emission reduction goal is, at least the interim goal, first. And then once they all have agreement on that goal, then they go off in a fairly differentiated way to each meet that goal, almost sort of the way that states in the U.S. Meet the ambient air quality goals with their state implementation plans here in the U.S. And to some extent, it appears from, at least from my standpoint, that some of the U.S. states and U.S. regions are getting at this global warming problem in a similar way, in that they are first achieving political consensus on an emission reduction goal for their state or for their region. And only then are they going off and to actually write the laws and the regulations that achieve those targets. And California is probably the best example of that, first enacting a law directing the state to essentially achieve certain emission reduction goals by certain dates, and then with a deadline for the state to go forth and promulgate, to come up with all the detailed regulations that will achieve those emission reductions. And I think that one result of that difference between the way a lot of the states are going forward with global warming policy and how the federal government is doing it is that probably in the states, my pet theory is there is going to be more political tolerance for diverse and differentiated action within different sectors of the state and regional economies, from different agencies within the states, etc., because they will all be able to focus and coordinate with each other around this central emission reduction target. And so I could imagine that in a lot of the programs that you all are putting together at the state or regional level, you will have cap-and-trade systems, potentially multi-sector cap-and-trade systems, responsible for achieving some portion, maybe even the large part, of the emission reduction targets that you've laid out for yourselves in statute and executive order. However, I would imagine that you will then, those cap-and-trade systems might not add up to the full emission reductions that you've set forth in your targets, and you may then make up the difference with other supplemental policies, including energy efficiency policies, tax policies, and other things like that, so that you are left with overall a comprehensive program that achieves the overall target. That mode of operating makes a lot of sense to me. Unfortunately, it does not appear to be what we're able to do in the Congress right now, because members, before they're willing to vote for a target, really need to be voting at the same time for a specific plan for achieving it. The other reason why at the federal level we are not, at least currently, under the current political circumstances, it seems, able to differentiate between enacting the target and then enacting the plan. And the reason why we are not able, therefore, to have as much differentiated action at the level of the plan that maybe the states are is also because we don't have, not only do we not have that enacted target, but we don't have sort of centralized leadership or coordination at the federal level, because the White House is not at the table, because the administration is not in support of any type of mandatory steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, much less in support of a cap-and-trade system. Because we don't have that sort of central coordinator, what we found, at least in the Senate, is sort of all the hopes and desires and expectations for Senate climate legislation have all gotten poured into one committee and into one bill. That is the EPW committee and the Lieberman-Warner bill. So this one bill that has been designed to move through one committee, and which did move through the committee in December, has been required not only to set forth what the emission reduction goal for the United States is going to be, it is also needed to set forth the entire plan for achieving that emission reduction goal from the entire U.S. economy. And it has to have done that in a way that fits within the jurisdiction of that one committee in the Senate. And that's been a very tall order. And essentially what we've been left with is a bill that has a very, very broad cap-and-trade system, because cap-and-trade does seem to be within the jurisdiction of the EPW committee. And so in order to make this cap-and-trade system, or in order to make the EPW jurisdiction sort of purport to solve the entire problem for the entire United States, we've had to fit in a very, very large percentage of total U.S. emissions under the caps that are set forth in our cap-and-trade system. When the bill was introduced I believe in October, the points of regulation and the structure of the cap-and-trade system were very similar to what they were in the McCain-Lieberman bill that was first introduced in 2003, with an upstream cap in the transportation sector, so on the importers and refiners of petroleum-based products, but downstream with respect to not only coal burning, but also natural gas burning. And essentially in the natural gas sector, the bill was capping natural gas burned downstream in the electric utility sector, in the electric power sector, and also in the manufacturing sector, and was not, for the most part, getting at emissions from burning natural gas in the commercial sector of the U.S. economy, and was really not getting at any of the emissions from burning natural gas in the residential sector of the economy. But still, the cap in this cap-and-trade bill was covering 75% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and Senators Lieberman and Warner thought that wasn't bad for one bill moving through one committee. But they were misinformed, and they were quickly informed by a lot of the people who vote on that committee that in order to get that bill through that committee, it was going to need to cover far more than 80% of total U.S. emissions under the caps. Essentially, the only way to do that is to do a mid or upstream cap on natural gas, which is what Senators Lieberman and Warner then did, first by essentially specking out that intent in the subcommittee reported bill, and then actually unpacking the language and putting the midstream cap on natural gas in the bill text in the chairman's mark at the full committee level in late November. And so now we have this cap in the natural gas sector, which is at the level of the natural gas processor. So the downstream burners of natural gas will not be handing in allowances. It will be the processors of natural gas who will be handing in allowances to account for the greenhouse gases that are emitted when that natural gas is then burned downstream. So now the bill covers, with that change, about 87% of total U.S. emissions under the caps in the bill. The problems we are facing is that capping natural gas in a cap-and-trade system anywhere other than downstream on the large emitters is extraordinarily complicated, both from an administrative substantive standpoint and also from a political standpoint. And so that is one of the difficulties we will face. The reason I bring this up is that you at the state and regional level don't necessarily face those same difficulties, because I don't think that all of you will necessarily be held to the same standard with regard to coverage of your total state or regional economy in a single mechanism, in a single cap-and-trade system. If you go for a cap-and-trade, you're probably going to be expected to cover the majority of your state or your region's emissions in that cap-and-trade system. But then there will, I think, be more tolerance for you getting at the uncovered or uncapped parts of the emissions with other complementary policies, be they energy efficiency or renewables promotion or other demand-side reduction measures, including tax policies and the like. So that is something to keep in mind, is that the federal bill might be more comprehensive, more integrated than your systems necessarily will need to be, or that they necessarily should be. So that was sort of a long ramble on that point. I thought I would close with a few minutes of just describing, just for your information, the way in which the bill that came out of the EPW committee in December deals with the issue of state authority to control greenhouse gas emissions at the state or regional level. The first part of the bill to look at in that regard is Section 9003, which is a very short but fairly strong retention of state authority provision. And what that simply says is that states are not preempted by this bill from adopting any standard cap, limitation, prohibition, or requirement that is at least as stringent in reducing greenhouse gas emissions as the standards, caps, limitations, prohibitions, and requirements set forth in this bill. So essentially, this federal bill does set a floor nationwide, but states are not preempted or precluded by the bill from being more stringent, both with respect to their cap-and-trade systems and with respect to their supplemental policies. So that's really the core part, and to some degree the most important. The second part is earlier in the bill, Section 3302, which is within the allocation system of the bill. And what Section 3302 does is it sets aside 2% of all the emission allowances in the federal cap, which we call the emission allowance account, sets aside 2% of those allowances each and every year of the program, and says that those allowances shall be distributed to those states that actually do enact and implement state-level cap-and-trade systems that are more stringent than this federal one laid out in this bill. And so that's an incentive, in fact, for the states to be stronger than the federal bill. What it also is, however, is that to the extent that a state like, say, California does enact a cap-and-trade system that is more stringent than this federal one, and to the extent that emitters in a state like that comply with that state law, but by virtue of that compliance actually generate some credits, what they would maybe call sort of over-compliance credits vis-a-vis the federal system, so that they've reduced their emissions more than they would have needed to under the federal bill alone, generating federal credits. The way the bill is written right now, and based on existing case law, those companies in those states would be able to sell those sort of excess compliance credits on the federal market. And what a state like, say, California can do with the allowances that it is allocated from the federal bill under Section 3302 is, if it chooses to, that state can retire those allowances, essentially take them out of commission, and in effect be tightening the federal cap to account for the leakage that occurs when a over-complying emitter in a state like California sells those over-compliance credits on the federal market. And in fact, the number of allowances that could be retired in that way is far more than 2% of the total emission allowance account, because states are allocated allowances through lots of other parts of the bill, even states that do not enact any global warming policies. There's a big chunk of allowances that are allocated to states just based on things like how much LIHEAP they rely upon and how much energy they produce and what their population is. And so any of those states actually is allowed by the bill to retire, essentially tear up as many of the federal allowances that they receive that they want to tear up or retire. So that is a way under the bill that states really as a whole really receive far more allowances than one would project they would actually need to make up for any leakage effect that might occur if there are state emission reduction caps more stringent than the federal ones. So there, I've probably gone on far enough, and I'll leave it there and look forward to questions toward the end.
Thanks, David. I just want to let everybody know that they weren't seeing slides moving for David's, but they will for Lori's. David was talking without slides, so a couple of people typed in questions asking that question. That's why. David, before we turn to Lori, these a lot of folks on the phone are stakeholders or involved in the Western Climate Initiative or the Midwest Climate Initiative. Can you just maybe in a sort of a brief version talk about some of the key design elements in Lieberman Warner? These folks are, I think you talked a bit about scope, how are offsets treated, allowance distribution, linking to other programs. Can you sort of maybe the top 2 or 3 key design features that you would describe for this program?
Sure. With respect to, say, compliance flexibility or cost containment mechanisms, and starting with offsets, a covered facility, so a facility whose emissions are under the cap in the Lieberman-Warner bill, can satisfy each year up to 15% of its annual compliance obligation with offsets. So up to 15% of the credits that company would need to hand in at the end of the year to cover its greenhouse gas emissions for that year can be credits that have been generated via offset projects. On top of that, an additional 15% of the credits that such a company would owe can be credits purchased on a foreign, i.e. international, emission trading market, provided that EPA has first certified that market as being pursuant to national caps that are as stringent as the U.S. ones, and so long as EPA is also pre-certified that the emission trading market is sort of as credible and transparent and reliable as the U.S. one. And then on top of that 15%, a company subject to the law can satisfy up to 15% of its annual compliance obligation with credits that it has borrowed from future years' caps. There's a system set out, or directive to EPA to set up a system allowing companies to essentially conduct those types of loans or borrow. And the term of the loan is limited to 5 years, and there's an interest rate attached to the loan. But those are 3 of the main compliance flexibility options or cost containment mechanisms that are there from the get-go: offsets, international credits, and borrowing. Of course, the ability to trade, and there's unlimited trading, and the ability to bank or save allowances, and there's unlimited banking in the bill, are themselves probably the most robust cost containment mechanisms in the bill. And maybe I'll mention just one other part. With regard to the emission allocation system, at the beginning of the program, somewhat less than 50% of the allowances in the emission allowance account are allocated out rather than auctioned. A lot of the recipients of those allocated allowances, however, are not covered facilities, but rather are, for instance, as I was referring earlier, the states. They receive an enormous number of allowances. Load-serving entities who are not, within the electric sector receive a lot of allowances. Farmers and foresters receive a lot of allowances for sequestration activities. However, there are a lot of allowances left over and allocated for covered facilities in sort of a transitional program, which phases out over time, so that by 15 years or so into the program, you have over 70% of the allowances are auctioned with the proceeds used in ways specified in the bill, and the remaining allowances that are given away without being auctioned are not given to covered facilities, but rather are still the ones left over that are just going to states and entities such as that.
Thanks so much. We have a lot of questions. I think most of them will want to get Lori in on as well. So let's, actually, we're getting one here that maybe we'll get you to answer, David, before we turn to Lori. Can you review the next steps for the bill? What do you see as the future?
Well, the next step would be for the majority leader to call up the bill on the floor. And he has said that he wants to do that. The chairman of the committee that reported the bill, Chairman Boxer, who will be the floor manager of the bill in the Senate, has said that she wants that to happen as well. And she said, moreover, that she wants it to happen in the first half of the year. I would imagine, although I haven't seen the majority leader specifically said that, I would imagine he would also prefer the first half of the year. So in my mind, I've sort of been using as kind of an organizing principle for the work that we've been doing here, thinking about the bill being brought up on the floor before Memorial Day. And so it'll be brought up on the floor. The first vote would likely be on the motion to proceed to the bill. And if that motion is filibustered at all, and maybe it would be, but if it is, maybe it would not be, but if it is filibustered at all, I think there's actually substantial likelihood of us breaking that filibuster, getting over 60 votes on the motion to proceed to the bill, because I think there are a lot of people out there in the Senate who, while they have reservations with the bill, they want to work out those reservations via amendments. And I think there are relatively few senators, there are some, but there are relatively few, who really are comfortable being publicly seen as not wanting for the Senate to even debate this issue and not even want to consider amendments. So I think there's probably an over 50% chance that the bill will be called up in the first half of this year. I think there's an over 50% chance when it is called up that we would get past a motion to proceed and therefore be on the bill. Once we're on the bill, anything can happen. There are still a lot of very divisive issues in this legislation, a lot of divisive issues that will come up on the floor. And the task for an office like this one, really, working with Chairman Boxer, Senator Warner, Senator Baucus, Senators Bingaman and Specter, and others, is to see whether it is possible between now and when the bill is brought up to defuse any or potentially even all of these very divisive issues, so that when they are considered on the floor, the provisions that are adopted to address those issues aren't poison pills. They don't eviscerate the political support, underlying political support for the bill. That's really the main substantive project I see in the weeks and months ahead. And I think we have a good shot at succeeding, but it's by no means sure that we will succeed.
Thank you so much, David. So let's turn to Lori. Lori, are you ready?
Yes. And I will try to click my slide. Okay, this is Lori Schmidt, and as Judy said, I work for the Committee on Commerce and Energy and Commerce in the House, and the subcommittee with specific responsibility for climate change legislation is the Energy and Air Quality Subcommittee, which is headed by Chairman Boucher from Virginia. And before we get into the substance, I want to give you a little bit of the process in the House, because we are in a very, very different position in the House than we are in the Senate. The Senate, the last few years, has had the benefit of senators like Lieberman and McCain and Bingaman pushing very hard on climate legislation, getting the issue raised, and they've been working on the details of that for quite some time. In the House, in contrast, in the last Congress, in the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee with primary jurisdiction over climate change, there were a total of 2 hearings, and those were on the question of whether the statistical methodology that Mann used when he put together the hockey stick study reconstructing global temperatures, whether that was the appropriate methodology or not. So the focus was all on trying to debunk climate change as something that was really happening. And I think if you go back throughout the Bush administration in E&C, those were the only 2 hearings that we had. And as I said, they were on this very narrow issue of whether this one study was what used the right methodology or not. So when we started last year, we really had a huge task in front of us, which was to educate our members about climate change and about what climate change legislation would look like. And the members are all smart people. They'd been reading the papers. They had a layman's understanding of climate change, but they really hadn't looked at it in the way that you do when you're going to legislate on the issue. So we started in last year with a very aggressive set of hearings. I think we were doing at least one, if not two hearings a week for most of the spring. We wound up with a total of about 17 hearings and about 100 witnesses, including former Vice President Gore. And you could see in the members a change in their level of sophistication in terms of their understanding of the issue and what it was going to mean, both in terms of setting up a program and what happens if we don't do anything on climate change. So that was, we kind of hit the ground running with that. We also sent out a dinglegram to a lot of NGOs and trade associations and labor and asked them where they were on climate and how they thought a bill should be put together, and got back about 80 responses. I think we had more than twice as many responses as we had letters that went out. In about April or May, at the request of leadership, we had to focus or change our focus from climate change to the energy bill that was eventually signed in December. Although even when we moved to the energy bill, we did it with a climate overlay, and I think it had been very helpful that we had the series of climate change hearings that we had leading into it, because we members recognized that it was important to try to solve the energy security issue and climate change together rather than solving them each independently. And the energy bill, as a result, I think has some very important provisions for climate change. The one that got the most attention was CAFE. We tightened the CAFE standards for the first time in 30 years, and with the result that vehicles will be 40% more efficient by 2022. Or I actually don't do the auto piece of this, but I think that's the number, by 2022. In addition to that, we also had a lot of efficiency standards for buildings and for appliances, and if those are fully funded, at least the ones that passed out of committee, if they were fully funded, they would result in a reduction of 10 billion tons of CO2 in 2030. Now, I don't know what the final score was of the bill as it was signed, but the efficiency standards, which were non-controversial and seemed to sneak by, actually do play a very important role in reducing our demand for energy and therefore reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and make the rest of the reductions easier to get. And then the other piece of this was in the renewable transportation fuels mandate, the ethanol, well, it's not just ethanol, it's the biofuels mandate. We added in a greenhouse gas reduction requirement, and for the next generation of biofuels, we were requiring that they be 50 to 60% lower in terms of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than the fuel that they're replacing, either gasoline or diesel. The other thing I wanted to mention also, although it was not in our committee, is in the appropriations bill, there is a requirement that EPA establish a greenhouse gas registry. So EPA is working on that. One of the most important lessons we've learned from the EU in terms of putting together a cap and trade program is that it's very important to understand what the baseline emissions are. So EPA should be starting on that while we're going through the legislative process here. This year in Energy and Commerce, we are refocusing on climate change legislation, and in the normal course, if we were doing this with kind of in regular order, we would probably be having additional hearings because there's a lot more on climate change and design of climate change legislation that we need to know. We are concerned, however, that having more hearings will delay the process rather than moving it forward expeditiously. So we're trying to kind of skip a few steps, and we're moving into a white paper process. We released our first white paper in October before negotiations with the Senate on the energy bill got hot and heavy, and then are returning to the white paper process now. And with the white papers, what we're going to be doing is looking at what we think the key design issues are for federal legislation, and then trying to educate the members and also everyone all the stakeholders that are interested in it, on both factual basis for how we think things lay out, what the facts are that we need to base the decision on, and then where the the subcommittee and committee chairmen have specific views and think they see the way forward, we'll put that out or at least indicate where we're intending to go with it, and then also ask questions so that we can focus people's attention on what additional factual information we need and what the key legislative decisions are that we're going to make. And here I would, I guess, reemphasize what David said about Congress wanting to put the details in and not adopt broad goals and then leave it to either to executive branch agencies or to a later piece of legislation to decide how we do that. My boss in particular believes it is very important for Congress to make the hard calls, that's what they get elected for rather than just bumping them to the executive branch. So we are, I know that California just has a very, very broad directive in terms of what they're supposed to do. There is some legislation that has been introduced in the House that would set up broad programmatic goals and then leave it to the agencies to figure out all the individual requirements. We are going to be unlikely to do that in the House for a variety of reasons. So I think that dovetails with what David had said on that. In addition, kind of overlapping with the white papers, we'll also be holding hearings on the issues raised in the white papers so we can hear back from the stakeholders about what they're interested in or what their views are on how we resolve those issues. It's also a way for us to kind of focus lobbyists' attention so that when they go in and talk to our members, they know what they need to be educating the members on. We're hoping in the hearings as well to get a sense of where the members are on this so that we can then start drafting legislation. We don't have a specific schedule for this. Whenever Chairman Dingell is asked, he says he's a legislator, not a seer. He's not a prophet, and that his responses will do it as fast as we possibly can. Both Chairman Boucher and Chairman Dingell are very interested in moving forward this year. Chairman Boucher in particular has said that he wants to see a bill signed by the President by the end of the year. Chairman Dingell certainly recognizes, as does Chairman Boucher, that that's an ambitious schedule, but it's the direction that the staff is operating under at this point. There are a few things that the chairman at least have decided about what should be in a comprehensive climate change legislative package. One is that the ultimate goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 60 to 80% by 2050, and the second, that it needs to be a mandatory economy-wide program. In some ways, it's kind of it seems odd to me that the mandatory is still at issue, although that is not where the President is on this. But we have decided it needs to be mandatory and economy-wide, and that the cornerstone of that should be a cap-and-trade program. In addition to the cap-and-trade program, we think that there may be other things that will be important to achieve the ultimate goal for climate reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There may be a role for taxes. There certainly will be a role for R&D funding. There may be some industries that need performance standards, either in addition to or instead of the cap-and-trade program, and I'll talk about kind of the specifics on that a little bit more. The one thing I do want to mention, just so people aren't confused, Chairman Dingell has been a strong proponent of having carbon taxes imposed at the federal level. He has put out, last year, put out some specs for a carbon tax bill. That is something that he is doing out of the personal office rather than the committee office, because the committee doesn't have jurisdiction over taxes. So what he is doing on taxes would be kind of as a separate line. It is not instead of a cap-and-trade program, but would be in addition to it. And Chairman Dingell has also been very clear that this needs to be a fair program. Everyone needs to put their collection into the collection plate, and the goal that we're working towards is to get the maximum reductions at the lowest cost and the least economic disruption. And in terms of what the baseline is for the 60 to 80%, it was a question someone put in. I'm not sure what we're using as the baseline, but when you get to a 60 to 80% reduction by 2050, it doesn't much matter whether you're using that as a 1990 baseline or a current baseline. That the numbers are all pretty close to each other. In the first paper, the first white paper, what we focused on was a discussion of where emissions come from in the United States, what types of gases are covered, and what sectors and what activities in those sectors, how many sources are there in those sectors, and then talked some about both point of regulation and whether that sector would be amenable to inclusion in a cap and trade, and or whether additional complementary measures would be necessary. And the one thing that we would like to do as much as possible is cover all greenhouse gases and all sectors of the economy. Now, I say as much as possible. That's because there are some things. We do need a program that is one that can be administered efficiently. And as I go through some of the specific sectors, there may be some reasons to keep certain pieces out. For instance, agricultural emissions are very difficult to quantify, so that may mean that if you can't quantify them, it's hard to keep them in a cap and trade program. But as much as possible, we want all greenhouse gases and all sectors, although there may be some sectors where we need other types of standards rather than cap and trade. And then this next slide, Figure 2, just shows the different sectors and how much they contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And these are all figures, by the way, from our white paper. And then Figure 3 is a way for each of the different sectors to break down what types of activities are causing the emissions within the individual sectors. And let me one of the things that makes a cap and trade program both harder and easier to design is that the point of regulation does not necessarily need to be the source of the emissions, and for some of these sectors that's fairly important. The first sector that we looked at in the white paper was electricity generation, and in some ways because of the trading programs that are already established for electricity generation, that's probably the easiest to include in a cap and trade program. And our preference on that would be to have the point of regulation be the electricity generating facilities themselves, which is the way it works under the current Clean Air Act programs. And then only units above a certain threshold would be included in the program. Again, that's consistent with the way the acid rain program, for instance, those with a generating capacity of 25 megawatts or smaller are not included. We would either need a generation capacity or potential annual CO2 emissions as a threshold. But that's probably the easiest sector. The next sector is the transportation sector, and there if you tried to do the same thing with the transportation sector that you do with electricity generation, where the point of regulation is the emitter, you'd wind up with each of us when we drive cars or cars or trucks having to turn in allowances to cover those. For a number of reasons, including the fact that there are way too many of us driving to make that an efficient way to do a cap and trade program, we looked at other possible points of regulations, and it looks to us like the most efficient point of regulation would be the refiners and importers of transportation fuel, and I think it sounds like that's consistent with what they're looking at in the Senate. The one thing with transportation is that a cap and trade, including them in a cap and trade by itself, is probably not enough to encourage the type of technology development that we think we need in the transportation sector, and that we're going to need. That's one where we definitely need complementary measures. Efficiency standards for cars, like we just passed with CAFE. We probably also need something to encourage consumers to buy lower emitting vehicles or to change their driving patterns, and that may be perhaps through the use of tax incentives. Next is the industrial sector, and this is one that, clicking the wrong thing, that scares a lot of people, or at least it's used to scare a lot of people, because there are literally tens of thousands of sources, hundreds of thousands of sources actually, and one of the arguments we hear against cap and trade is there's no way you can have an efficient program if you're having hundreds of thousands of sources, which I agree with. I think that would not be doable for cap and trade. But if you look at Figure 6, the blank bar, or the white bars are the number of sources. The red bars are the CO2 emissions. And you can see from the top half or so of the chart that there are some industries where there are a significant number of sources but very, very low CO2 emissions. And on the bottom part that there are some industries that have very high CO2 emissions, and some of them with relatively few sources. And another way to look at kind of similar information is on Figure 7. The darkest part of the bar shows what the emissions are from sources that emit more than 10,000 metric tons of CO2. So you can see that the large emitters are really concentrated in very few industries, which makes it much more doable to include them in a cap and trade program. We are going to need, the industrial sector is one where there's an absence of data that is, that ideally you would want to include them in a program, and there may be some of this in terms of natural gas, if they're using natural gas, that there may be different ways to get at the emissions, which let me flip now to, or go next to the commercial sector. The commercial sector, which includes things like large commercial buildings, if the point of regulation is downstream in the commercial sector, we're going to have a lot of sources with very low emissions, which means we're not really going, even if we use a threshold, we're not going to pick up that many or that much in terms of emissions from this. And so one of the things that we're looking at is whether there's a way to regulate upstream or midstream, and we need to look a little bit more at what was done in the Lieberman-Warner bill on that. If we just have large hospitals and universities and things like that, which are the ones most likely to be the large emitters, we're really going to be missing quite a few of the emissions from this. But if we go to the fuel providers, processors, or producers, we could pick up most of the sector's emissions at that point in the process. In addition, commercial buildings lend themselves to building codes and efficiency or other performance standards that could be very helpful in reducing emissions from this sector, and it may be that there are some tax incentives here that would be useful as well. Included in this sector also are landfills. I'm not quite sure why landfills get included in the commercial activities because they seem very different from commercial buildings. But landfills are an example of a situation where it's very difficult to measure the emissions from a landfill. It is very easy, though, to figure out what the reductions are if you do like if you capture the methane and then use it. Landfill probably not covered in a cap and trade directly, but that could be a source for offsets or credits. And then the residential sector, in some ways very similar to the commercial sector, you really can't get it through downstream regulation, but we are looking at upstream or midstream, again, looking at the fuel providers, processors, or producers. And this is one, again, where building codes, tax incentives, efficiency standards could be helpful here. And then finally, the agricultural sector's direct emissions are in many ways like landfills. We really can't measure the direct emissions very easily, but there are certain things like from CAFOs where we could measure the reductions in emissions, and that could be a useful source of offsets or credits. The other white papers that we're looking at and the other issues that we're going to have to address will be controlling costs, engaging developing countries, offsets and credits, the appropriate roles for federal, state, local, and tribal governments, distributing allowances, and that will include looking at an auction, and then encouraging geologic carbon sequestration. Chairman Boucher in particular is very interested in making sure that coal maintains its role as a major component of our energy policy, and to do that, we have to figure out a way to get carbon sequestration to work. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Lori. We have a lot of questions, and I guess we'll open it up for both of you to answer. I guess either jump in first, or I might pick on one of you. One question is, given the clear need for natural gas as a transitional fuel, why does legislation contemplate capping emissions associated with production of natural gas? Shouldn't we be encouraging natural gas as an alternative to coal or imported oil, I guess, and as opposed to electricity?
I can try to answer that.
Sure.
We want to be encouraging the use of clean fuels, and we also want to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And natural gas is relatively clean, and the use of natural gas also emits a lot of CO2. Not as much as the use of other fuels, but it does emit a lot of CO2. While there are things that we need to be very careful with in our treatment of natural gas so that we don't have perverse impacts, if we left natural gas completely on the table, it does not appear that the United States would reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to the degree the scientists are saying is necessary. So we have no choice. There are a lot of other good things out there that people do, a lot of other good things people out there do that have the impact of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in some ways, but that also do themselves emit greenhouse gases. The scientists tell us that we need to get at so many emissions, so many of the U.S. sources of emissions, and we need to achieve reductions on such a degree that there are very few things that we can leave on the table. One thing that the economic modeling of the McCain-Lieberman bill indicated, and we rely on that modeling to quite an extent, and that's the modeling conducted both by EPA and by the Energy Information Administration, is that at least with the downstream cap on natural gas use in that bill, natural gas still did very well. You did not see as much of the widespread fuel switching that maybe you would otherwise see from coal to natural gas, although I would submit you don't want to see that type of fuel switching because then the farmers and the chemical manufacturers and consumers get very, very upset. But you do still see natural gas usage increasing substantially. And I think that if you look at the EPA and EIA economic modeling of the Bigham Inspector bill, which has the same type of point of regulation in the natural gas sector that we now have in the Lieberman-Warner bill, you also see that natural gas usage is still very robust in this country. We will now need to see if the same is true when you have the type of natural gas point of regulation that we see in these two bills, but where you have caps and deadlines on the level of stringency that exist in the Lieberman-Warner bill. And that's one of the many reasons why we're looking forward to getting the modeling results from EPA in February and from EIA in March or April of the committee-reported bill. But the short answer to your question is just we have no choice. We can't leave natural gas on the table. Otherwise, we will not curb greenhouse gas emissions as much as we need to.
I'd also give a slightly kind of the same result but a different answer, which is politically, if it looks like there is going to be a major decline in coal usage, I think we are going to have a very difficult time getting a bill out of the House. Politically, there are too many members with interests in or constituents back home that depend on coal. So what we've been looking at is less how do we switch away from coal and how do we make, rather than doing that, focusing on how do we make coal clean. And if you sequester most of the carbon, you will be able to reduce most of the emissions, most of the CO2 emissions. I don't know that really 100% capture is possible, but if you sequester the emissions, you can actually reduce emissions pretty dramatically because you're reducing the emissions from a facility that produces a lot of CO2. You should be able to eventually do it fairly cost effectively. And one of in addition to the kind of the coal state folks that have grave concerns about undermining their local economies. There are also some of the industries, the chemical industry, the fertilizer industry, that are very dependent on natural gas. And if it looks like natural gas prices are going to go way up because there's going to be a huge shift from coal to natural gas, we're going to have trouble getting support from those industries, and we could wind up seeing even more jobs moved offshore. At least that's the argument that will be made. So I think we need to keep coal a part of the mix politically, and I mean it does supply over 50% of our electricity right now. Thinking that we're going to change that dramatically in the short run, I think, is not very realistic.
Laura, another question directed to you. What do you see as the major discrepancies between the House and Senate focus?
At this point, I don't know that there are really discrepancies. That the Senate is just so much farther along than we are that, I think actually in a lot of ways, and talking through the point of regulation, which is where we've made the most comments so far, I think we're fairly consistent with what the Senate is doing. We'll have to see what happens, what emerges from the Senate after it gets off the floor, and we'll need to see where our members shake out on some of the other issues. And I guess maybe I should say, I think one issue where I think we are going to be somewhat different, certainly where Chairman Boxer and Chairman Dingell start from different perspectives, is on preemption. Chairman Dingell is more inclined, I think is less inclined to defer to the states, and is going to be looking at that issue more carefully. I don't mean to not more carefully. He just comes at it from a different perspective. I think it's no secret that if it were up to him on vehicle standards, his preference would be to preempt the states all around, which I realize is not a popular viewpoint, particularly among states. But he does come at it from a very different perspective, and particularly on vehicle standards, I think he is concerned about what that's doing to the domestic auto industry, and is concerned that if you have California and other states who don't really have domestic auto industries making decisions that effectively turn California standards into national standards, that's being done without anyone representing Michigan having a vote in what's going on. And given how dire the straits are in Michigan right now economically, he's got some big concerns about that. But even more generally on preemption, I think we'll be looking very carefully to try to figure out what is given the daunting challenge that we have of getting down to 60 to 80% reductions, and the need to do it. I mean, it requires such major changes in the economy and how we approach things in this country that I really think it's going to be necessary for us to spend some very careful time thinking about what's best for the states, what's best for the local, what's best for the federal government to do, so that we're using our resources efficiently and not having duplicative programs.
David, do you want to comment on that?
No, I think that, I'll say no and then I'll start commenting. I think that what Lori says should be, people really need to take to heart what she points out, that there are a lot of very powerful voices in both the House and the Senate that are very uneasy with the notion of differentiated action to curb global warming happening at the state level. I think that when you, on some of these issues, when you unpack what is meant by state authority and what would the states actually be doing, you do find, I think, sometimes more grounds for agreement than when you start at the level of sort of labels or terminology. For instance, there are states right now that have their own building codes and their own efficiency building codes, and a lot of their other types of efficiency standards and a lot of other types of policies that have the impact of reducing global warming, and those are differentiated around the country. When you start getting into talking, however, about the cap-and-trade systems and states actually enacting their own cap-and-trade systems and then having there be a federal one overlaying it or underlying it, I think that the answer to the question there, the political answer, is going to come in asking, what does that actually mean for a company in one of those states? If you were a power plant in California, and you are subject to a federal cap-and-trade system and to a state cap-and-trade system, what is life really like for you? What do you have to do each year? What are the costs? And I think we need to actually be able to describe in incredible detail what life is really like for a company like that. What does it mean to be subject to those two systems simultaneously? And look in that description for elements that appear palpably unfair to the emitter in a state like that. And where there are elements in that story that are palpably unfair, if there are any, we're going to have to do something about them if we actually want to enact a bill that preserves state authority.
Thanks, David. I'm going to take a call. I'm going to go to the phone because I like to say that and take a question from there.
Participant line. Hi, it's Kim Krieger calling from the Argus Air Daily. This is directed specifically at David, but Lori can weigh in too with the perspective. Are there further cost containment actions that you're considering now, in addition to the ones that you laid out? And secondarily, there was a big, some members in the Senate wanted specific provisions for nuclear, and those were left out, but I think Senator Lieberman in particular said those would be taken up again on the floor. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I think the guiding principle for Senator Lieberman with respect to the floor is going to be picking up votes without losing votes. In other words, having a net gain in votes. And there are ways that the bill could be changed to address cost containment that would pick up more votes than it would lose, and there are ways to do that where there would be a net loss in votes. I think one way in which it could be done where there would be a net loss in votes would be if it were done in a way that the environmental community perceived as clearly weakening the bill, clearly compromising its environmental performance. So on cost containment, he does not, and I do not believe Senator Warner either believes that the way cost containment is done in the bill as it was reported from the committee is necessarily the last word or even the last word for this year. And so they're very open to conversations and they're very open to hearing ideas, and I believe that Chairman Boxer is as well. But all of them, I believe, are going to be very careful because the bill as it is written right now is already balanced very carefully, both substantively and politically. And they're going to be looking to make changes that attract more support without, however, disrupting that balance. I think, again, as I said about something else before, I think we have a significant shot at doing that, and I think that we're going to very carefully be undergoing conversations to try to do that. But it's by no means assured that we can do that we can make changes on something like cost containment that pick up support, say, to the center-right, without causing people on the left, like, say, the environmental community, to believe and to say publicly that the bill has been compromised environmentally. But we're going to try. On nuclear, I think that Senator Lieberman happens to be a supporter of expanding use of nuclear energy in this country, as is Senator Warner. Senator Boxer traditionally has not been, because of a lot of very understandable concerns about proliferation and safety and security and waste disposal, obviously. So I think that there is conceivably room for adding the word nuclear to the bill, adding provisions that are related to nuclear power that do not offend a lot of the traditional skeptics of nuclear energy in this country. Whether those types of provisions will be enough, however, to satisfy those on the Senate floor who believe they can't support a program like this without very explicit nuclear support, again, it's an open question, but it certainly merits a conversation, and I believe that Senators Lieberman and Warner want to be reaching out and having that conversation with people.
Thanks, David. Lori, did you want to comment on nuclear or on cost containment?
On cost containment, that is one of the issues we're going to be putting a white paper out on. And on nuclear, the one thing I'd mention is that is something that my boss is supportive of as well.
We have a question, I think, for David. To what extent does the Lieberman-Warner bill consider the perspective of linking the U.S. cap-and-trade system to other international trading systems, such as, for example, the EU emissions trading scheme?
That's a good question. I think that we have considered it only in the sense of trying to avoid mechanisms that people have told us will definitely hinder or prevent linkage with the international system. I think that Senator Lieberman believes that international linkage would be a good thing because the broader and more liquid the market you have, the lower the market price of an allowance will be, and therefore the lower the overall average compliance cost will be for U.S. companies. So he likes the idea of linking to foreign markets, and there's already, as I described earlier on the call, sort of one type of linkage already spec'd out in the bill. That said, we have enough to worry about in getting this domestic legislation to move through the Senate, and Lori has enough to worry about it with it moving through the House without making international linkage a top priority or one of the main things that we worry about. We just have too many other things to worry about. I think Senator Lieberman's main concern and the main thing he focuses on when he's working on these provisions and when he's in negotiations about them is getting a strong, broad cap-and-trade climate bill to move as far through the federal political system as possible, as quickly as possible, toward enactment. We have shied away from mechanisms where people have been able to make a strong case that it would be a significant blockage to linkage, and the price cap or the safety valve is one such mechanism where the potential of preventing linkage with, say, the EU ETS was one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why Senator Lieberman has never embraced that type of a price cap. But generally, it's not something that we are really feel we have the luxury to be reaching out for, looking for ways to design the system that will maximize the likelihood of linkage with the foreign trading systems. We just have too much to worry about with just getting political support for the system here domestically.
David, can I just follow up? There is a limit, though, on the extent to which you can use international allowances for compliance, right?
Oh, certainly, and that I think that it also is an example of how international linkage is not the primary motivation, or even in the top 10 primary motivations that have led to the design of the bill the way it is right now, and the limited use of credits purchased on, say, the EU ETS domestically that is allowed for in this bill is motivated by the desire to contain compliance costs for U.S. companies, not really motivated by the desire necessarily to advance the ball to creating a global fungible market.
Lori, did you want to comment on linkage?
That's one of the issues we're going to be looking at, but I would concur with David that the main thing is going to be getting the program through. If we can link that, that'll be great, but that's not a primary objective.
Okay. We have another question. I think this is to David. There's an active voluntary offset market now. Is there consideration in the Lieberman-Warner bill to give credit for voluntary offsets as early action? How would this be defined?
Well, the short answer is it's not yet defined. There are a lot of credits set aside in the bill for awarding companies and other covered facilities that have taken early action to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and there's no reason why they could not get. There's no reason why they necessarily could not get early action credit from this set aside for actions that they have also maybe received some type of benefit for under an existing voluntary offset market. Because our set-aside credits for early action are from under the cap or within the cap. And so you don't have to worry about the use of those set-aside allowances causing a busting or a weakening of the cap because they've already been carved out of our cap. So I don't believe that the fact that a company has registered its early action on a voluntary emissions exchange would necessarily disqualify it as a recipient of set-aside early action credits under the Lieberman-Warner bill as it's written. But as far as what particular activities companies would be getting early action credits for, I just have to admit that the text of the bill right now does not answer that question. A lot with respect to who's going to be getting early action credits for what is, as the bill is written right now, left to the discretion of the EPA administrator.
So a question for Lori. Where are the white papers available?
I'm trying to get the website right now. They're on the Energy and Commerce website somewhere, but I have to confess that I went to try to find it last night and couldn't. So I'm trying to get a specific link for you.
That's great. And also another one for you, just to clarify, does Chairman Dingell contemplate both a cap-and-trade program and a carbon tax?
He certainly sees that as a possibility, that they could be complementary programs.
And another question for David. What happens to state auction revenues? And this is if you have a state program and then you have a federal program in addition, how would the state auction revenues be treated?
Good question. And I think that that gets to that's one of the things I had in mind when I was referring to telling the story of what life would be like for a emitter in a state that has a state cap-and-trade system at the same time that there's a federal cap-and-trade system in place, telling the story and looking for any elements of that that might seem palpably unfair and thus need attention. I think the real question, it'd be fairly easy if, I think in negotiating with the states as we move toward enactment, I could see the federal government potentially, and Congress, potentially agreeing to cede auction revenues for emission allowances that represent that portion of the overlap between the federal compliance obligation and the state compliance obligation. But that has not been worked out yet, and because it has not been worked out yet, one question that I guess an emitter in one of these states could have is, am I going to need to pay twice for the same ton of CO2? Am I going to need to buy a federal credit and a state credit for the exact same ton of CO2 that comes out of my smokestack? Am I going to have to be paying twice? Is that what life is going to be like for me as happening to be in one of these states that has a cap-and-trade system? And I think that is, right now, that is a question for a lot of you on the phone. Is it your position? Is it the position of states who are enacting and moving forward with these types of programs that a company in one of your states should indeed have to pay double for a ton, not just pay the state for those credits that sort of exceed the credits that the company would be purchasing from the federal government for the federal compliance obligation, but actually buy from the states all of the credits making up that state's compliance obligation. And I think that I'm at this point just eager to hear over the weeks ahead what the answer from state governments is. Is the answer yes? They expect companies in their states to pay twice for the same ton of CO2. If that's the case, I think we just up here we need to know that's the position of the states. If the answer is no, that that for instance that states would be content with with a company just paying to the federal government for credits, except for those that represent the extent to which the state system is more stringent than the federal program, then that's also something we need to know, because the answer to that question is politically very consequential here in the Congress.
Okay, and Lori just sent in the web address for the white papers. Laura, can we circulate that to everyone? Laura?
Sure.
So we'll get you that web address for the white papers. The way that my software here works, things are jumping around, but there's a question about the concern under the EU ETS about windfall profits and whether Lori and David have looked at that. Here it is. Under the cap-and-trade system being utilized in the EU electricity sector, windfall profits have become a matter of great concern. What specific safeguards are being considered to prevent a similar scenario in the U.S.?
Well, I can maybe say briefly one thing that's being considered is that the Lieberman-Warner bill does not freely allocate 100% of the allowances to the regulated emitters, which is what was done in the EU in the first phase. So I believe we already have to some degree incorporated the experience of the EU by not allocating 100% of the credits to the emitters in the first instance. As I mentioned earlier, even from the get-go of the program, half or more of the credits are auctioned off under the Lieberman-Warner bill, and a substantial portion of those credits that are not auctioned off, but rather are freely allocated, are not allocated to the emitters. They're allocated to other people like state governments or to non-regulated farmers and foresters. Some are regulated for reducing the rate of tropical deforestation abroad and things like that. So the question is, do you really need to auction off 100% of the allowances from day one of the program in order to prevent windfalls? Is preventing any windfall from ever happening anywhere in the United States the primary goal of this legislation? Or is it rather maybe a secondary or tertiary goal? Where do you draw the line in order to get a bill passed?
The one thing I would add to that, and certainly the windfall profits issue is one that we'll be looking at here as well, is that it looks like part of the problem with the EU was that they did not have good baseline information in terms of the emissions, and hopefully that's a mistake we can avoid here. And I think EPA starting on the greenhouse gas registry now and starting to get that in place will be helpful in that respect.
Okay, we have a question. What do you see as key actions that states may take to obtain a singular state or federal cap-and-trade program?
A similar or singular?
It says singular, and I guess maybe I would interpret this question as harmonization. How can you what are some of your suggestions for promoting harmonization between how states are proceeding and how the feds are?
One way that occurs to me is just, I think right now, really over the next few weeks, I think that people working on climate legislation in the Senate and the House need the opportunity, I believe, to talk to state houses in parts of the country that are working on state and regional cap-and-trade systems now, to really go over this question of let's first get agreement on a credible and fairly detailed description of what life could look like for a company in a state that has its own cap-and-trade system at the same time that the federal government has it. To get sort of agreement on what we know based on the different state and federal programs that have been drafted to date, and then to try to get agreement on which parts of those stories, if any, are palpably unfair to emitters in those states. If there are no elements of that story that are palpably unfair, then probably with respect to the Lieberman-Warner bill, it would just be a matter of states being ready to help us lobby against preemption amendments on the Senate floor. But if there are any elements that really it is hard to defend, then I think we'll really need the engagement with states to sort of give us the ability and flexibility to tweak some provisions in the bill so that we eliminate any parts of the story that really do appear unfair.
Lori, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we certainly will be listening to here is what industry is telling us about what it will be like to comply with different regulatory systems. And that I think that one thing everyone should recognize is that one of the things, at least historically, that has brought industry to the table for federal environmental legislation was the desire to have a uniform requirement across the country rather than to have a lot of individual programs. And even with a cap-and-trade system, I know one of the things that I don't quite understand that we're going to be interested in hearing about is whether having allocations made on different bases, in a state government versus the federal government, whether that makes life too complicated for industry. But I think if industry is telling us there are major problems with multiple systems, that's going to be something we'll listen to pretty closely here. If industry is telling us that the way that the systems can be designed in a way that make it not difficult for them to comply with multiple systems, then the issue is much easier.
This is another one on the relationship between state and federal programs. Whether allowances issued by a state that are banked will be recognized when a federal program enters into force. In other words, will the value of those banked allowances be lost?
The answer is I don't know. I guess what you're referring to is that a company in a state that puts into place a cap-and-trade system prior to the federal cap-and-trade system coming into place, and where the company in that state, pursuant to that state system, has banked allowances. Are those going to be wiped out if the federal program does end up preempting the state program going forward? I don't think that the bill as it's written now, the Lieberman-Warner bill, does not answer that question. I think that's an issue we should talk about. My sense is they should not be wiped out. I also think that there are ways I can imagine that the federal program could use its allowance value and its set-asides to make those companies whole through, say, an expanded early action program.
Lori, did you want to comment on that one?
No, that's not an issue that we've thought about yet, but we will.
Okay. I'm going to do another one from the phones. I think there's another. Hi, is anybody there?
Hi, it's Kim Krieger. I think that you've accidentally asked me again.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, so at the moment I don't have anybody waiting in the phone queue, so back to the web questions. We had a question, which I hope I don't mess up by paraphrasing, on sort of the technology. How do you get the technology that we need to meet these very aggressive reductions? And Lori, do you want to take first crack?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of pieces kind of pulled together. One of the big questions about a cap and trade is whether that will spur technology innovation that isn't there right now. In the acid rain program, we had technology improving, but it was technology that already existed. Here we're really pushing for much more than that. We're looking at new technologies, breakthrough technologies being developed. And although some of my economists that I know will tell me that it will work and it will spur technology, we're not convinced that that's going to be enough on its own to spur technologies, at least some technologies. So I think what we'll probably be looking at is that plus I think that's one role where performance standards make sense. So for instance, the renewable fuel mandate, one of the reasons we put the 50 to 60% reduction in there for life cycle greenhouse gases from the next generation of biofuels is to make sure that we get the right technology breakthrough with biofuels. Not that what we did on biofuels is going to be all we ever need to do on fuels, but it at least should spur technology development in the cellulosic field, cellulosic ethanol field, so that we can have that available as an option to comply with the cap and trade. So I could foresee other performance standards like that being part of the program to push technology development. And then I think there'll also be a role either through allocating allowances or through normal funding for to spur technology development. I mean, such as the carbon sequestration, geologic sequestration, for instance. I know they had bonus allowances for that in the Senate bill, and I think something like that, where you're helping to push a certain technology, is probably going to be required or involved in the House bill as well.
And David, did you want to say anything about that?
I think Lori's right that it's something you want to do with several different types of mechanisms. The first big type of mechanism is just the setting of a price on the emission of greenhouse gases. I think that carbon price is probably the thing more than anything else that will drive the private investment into the advanced energy technologies. And no matter how much money we set aside through auction revenue or bonus allowances in a cap-and-trade bill like this, I imagine that it will be dwarfed by the value of the money that Wall Street is investing into those technologies as a result of the price signal. Another thing that Lori mentioned was the bonus allowances. I think that if the economic modeling tends to show that notwithstanding the price signal and, say, notwithstanding investment in R&D or deployment incentives, you find that at the moment where you project that a certain technology that you want, like carbon capture and storage, will be ready for prime time, it is nevertheless projected to still be more expensive than things like, say, nuclear energy, and thus won't deploy at the time that you want it to deploy. The provision of bonus allowances for the actual use of that technology, the actual injection of the CO2 underground, can be something that shows Wall Street now that if they invest now in getting the technology up and running, there will be money available at that moment to make sure that the investment will have been worthwhile. And then the final type of support is just the use of very large amounts of auction revenue to create incentive programs both at the consumer purchaser level and also at the developer vendor level for these technologies to get full-scale demonstration projects and also really commercialized projects up and running.
One more for David. Please repeat what you said about the degree to which allowances under the federal system may be sourced from the international carbon market. You mentioned that international credits may be used for compliance if they're certified, approved by the EPA. Does that include certified emissions reductions or CERs from the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism?
There is ambiguity in the bill right now on that point, but my understanding of the intent that led to the language that's written in the bill right now is that those sort of international offset credits would not be ones that domestic U.S. firms could submit in partial fulfillment of their compliance obligation under the federal law. Rather, it would be things like the EU ETS allowances that could be submitted. There is some ambiguity that will probably remain throughout to enactment because to some degree what types of international credits are going to be able to be submitted here domestically will have to be based on some determinations made by EPA about how those markets are run and also what types of emissions restrictions are leading to their creation so that those credits can really be deemed to be something that can be fungible with the U.S. emission allowances. So there will always, I think, be some ambiguity until the EPA promulgates regulations, but there is probably right now in the legislation more ambiguity than there needs to be about what type of international credits would be allowed. Just to answer your question, though, again, my understanding is that of the intent is that if you're sort of comparing, if you're using the EU as a case study, that EU ETS allowances could be allowed, but that the various types of international offset credits would not be allowed.
Thanks so much. We're close to being out of time. David or Lori, did you have any sort of final points you wanted to make that didn't get made, either in response to one another or something you thought of during this conversation? Lori, do you have anything?
No, not me.
David?
No, I don't either.
Thank you both so much, David Mcintosh and Lori Schmidt. We're really happy to have had you. We really appreciate the time. We know how busy you are. And I think many folks would really like to share their views with you. And I'm guessing, David, you made a little bit of an invitation about how should people sort of let the committees know what they're thinking about some of these important issues?
Well, on the Senate side, I think for the time being, you need to both contact either me or Chelsea Maxwell in Senator Warner's office and contact EPW majority staff, Bettina Poirier and or Eric Olson, that we are all meeting quite a lot together and coordinating quite closely, but we're trying to make sure we're all receiving as much of the same information as possible, and what that basically requires a lot of stakeholders to do right now, and I apologize for this, is to contact more than one person with the same message, and that would be me and Chelsea, or me or Chelsea on the one hand, but then also EPW majority staff on the other.
And Lori, anything from you on that about how people can provide information to you?
It would be to contact me and email is probably best.
Okay. Thanks so much again. We have our next webinar is next Tuesday, January 29th at the same time at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, and that's going to be on allowance distribution, moderated by Franz Litz, and the speakers are Chris Nelson from the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, Jill Duggan from the United Kingdom, and Kelly Kizier from Ireland EPA. And thank you so much for everyone for participating, and thanks again to our speakers, and we wish them luck with all the hard work that they have ahead of them.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.